Rahul Gandhi made a very interesting statement. He says this government is about nationalizing losses and privatizing profits. What exactly did he mean by that? Let's ask Akhilesh. Akhilesh, what exactly did Rahul Gandhi mean by that?
Sujit, I think it is a takeoff on the government's ambitious program to disinvest, privatize, and monetize. Now, the fact of the matter is that there are not going to be too many takers in the private sector for loss making government companies. So, they have no choice but to privatize the profit ones. So, the profitable ones that they are trying to privatize, they are talking about privatizing two public sector banks, one general insurance company. So the profit making ones is what they are trying to sell off to the private sector. And they will, of course, end up retaining the loss making ones, as we are seeing in the case of Air India, a huge loss making entity with no buyers in the private sector. I think he's just passed a sarcastic comment on where the entire government efforts are headed to. But that's the reality of the matter. Why will the private sector buy a loss-making government unit whose losses could be more deeper than what are being disclosed? It will, of course, want the profitable ones only, Sujit.
So the fact remains that what can the government do? कोई नहीं खरीदता है Air India. So what can the government do? What do you think? What options do the government have?
You know, the government has experimented a lot in this matter. They are very clear that they are loaded with a lot of assets which are underutilized or unutilized, or they are not worthy of government investments. And so the government should liquidate the asset and get the money out of it to be put to better use. So they started with disinvestment. Now, disinvestment means that you have a government undertaking which is, say, 100% owned by the government, and the government is willing to sell, let's say, 20% shareholding into the public or to private investors or whatever pedigree. But the point is, Sujit, that in disinvestment, the government continues to be the owner. So mismanagement continues, and investors are certainly not impressed by letting the government being the manager of that particular item. So disinvestment has not really gone off. It has not been as successful as it could have been, for the simple reason you may sell off a part of the government holding, but all the ills of the government management continue to plague that particular unit. So now the government is talking about privatization. Of course, in the Bajpayee government, you had a few instances of privatization, like we had Hindustan Zinc, which was privatized, we had Balco, which was privatized, we had Centaur Hotels, etc. This government is now talking also privatization, which is what the finance minister spoke in the recent budget. She's speaking about privatizing two public sector banks and one general insurance company. But I'm sure they are very clear that even that will meet with a lot of hurdles, which we will discuss soon, Sujit. So they are talking about monetizing, which is there are a lot of surplus government assets which are unutilized, underutilized. They are not put to use. They get no return on investment. So rather sell off those assets concerned and recycle the money back into more productive or more needed avenues like building infrastructure, etc. So I think that is what has been the journey of the government trying to sell, which Mr. Rahul Gandhi says that you are nationalizing losses and privatizing profits.
I want to know more specifically. What is the core difference between privatization, disinvestment, and monetization? Clear differentiation.
So I'll tell you the differences, Sujit. In disinvestment, the government offloads a small part of its ownership in a particular entity, and it continues to be the majority owner and continues to be in the management. So you may have a public sector bank, let's say, in which now 30% of the shares are held by the public or institutional investors. The government continues to be the manager of that institution. So all the ills that are associated with the government being the owner and manager, they continue in a disinvestment. This has actually failed so badly in the last few years that for the last couple of years, or rather since 2017, whenever the government had a target to disinvest, it has not been able to succeed doing it at all. Investors in the private sector have not been enthused. So now you come to what is called privatization. Privatization by implication means that here is a government undertaking in which it is willing to sell a majority of the shares to another private sector player who will now become the owner and manager and now will have private management in the institution. So we have privatization where an entire company would get sold, which is what the government has been trying to do with Air India. But in the case of Air India in particular, Sujit, the conditions attended to privatization are so discouraging that no investor has been willing to come forward. Like, for example, Air India is known to be heavily overstaffed and it has an aggressive trade union. And the government says that any investor who wants to buy Air India will have to necessarily continue with all the workforce that it has at least for 3 years. Till then, you can't retrench. Now, that is one of the key reasons why it's a loss-making entity. So, privatization means you are selling off the entire undertaking. But if you have these kind of attended conditions, you're not going to be able to succeed. Air India is a classic case. So now that disinvestment and privatization do not find flavor and favor with the private investors, the government is talking about monetization. So, for example, the railways have got about 47,000 hectares of prime surplus land. You don't sell the railways, but why don't you sell the land of the railways and get the money? Or there would be NTPC with a power plant which is not managing very well, it is underutilized. Why don't you sell the entire power plant to a private company? You don't sell NTPC. You don't sell the shares of NTPC, but you share an asset of NTPC. That's what monetization is all about. The government is talking about monetizing roads, highways, ports, airports, gas pipelines, telecommunication towers, and for your information, even sports stadiums.
So, if I understand right, Akhilesh, let me just put it in a simple terms. You are saying that if I sell an airplane, then that is monetization. And if I sell Air
Yes.
India, that is privatization. Correct?
Wonderful, Sujit. Yes,
Yeah?
Sujit.
Okay. Now, if I start selling roads, bridges, sports stadiums, aren't we selling the wealth of the country?
Well, Sujit, if you go by a conventional thinking, you are selling the wealth of the country. The silver of the family is being sold. But look at it from two perspectives. If the wealth of the country is being mismanaged and misused and is underutilized or unutilized and it gives no returns on investment for public good, and if you think you can recycle the wealth out of it, then recycle it and put it back for better use. So the government is talking that we intend to monetize and put it for building infrastructure. So, well, if it goes into infrastructure again, that is not really selling the family silver because it's recycling. It's like, breaking old gold ornaments and making new ornaments. But if the government is going to sell assets in order to meet its revenue expenditure, paying salaries and pension and interest, then you have certainly sold family silver, and I would not be in favor of it.
And current circumstances, it looks like that because the government needs revenue. The government needs revenue not to build infrastructure, but the government also needs revenue to run the operations. So obviously, a lot of this money is going to go into running the operations, isn't it?
Yes, Sudeep. In fact, the budget speech of the finance minister is an indicator because when she spoke about disinvestment, privatization, and monetization, she said that these are the measures that are being initiated in order to ensure that the fiscal deficit of the government, which is the excess expenditure of the government over the receipts, they intend to ensure that it recedes year after year by 2025. And in that, they have taken privatization, monetization as one of the receipts. So if you go by her speech, there is a very clear indicator that by selling the family silver, you might be just meeting expenditure for running the government. I would not favor it, Sujit.
Do you favor governments running business?
I think, Sujit, I am of the mindset that there are certain critical segments where the government would have to have a presence. Those are the strategic sectors, as they call it. For example, atomic power plants need to be run in the government sector. Even very critical defense technologies, I would still say that it ought to be in the government sector. So where there are these very critical sectors, the government needs to have what they call a commanding presence, but there are not too many. In the rest of it, you don't need government presence. You don't need the government to run power plants or run fertilizer plants or run chemical plants or for that matter, even run railways and roadways or manage ports. I think in all of them, the government should exit from it. And this government had said last year that they are trying to identify strategic sectors. In that, they would have a commanding presence. In the rest of them, they don't intend to have a presence. But it is easier said than done, Sujit. Once a PSU or a PSC set up, there are so many vested interests in it, right from the Neta Babu to all the vendors, that trying to get the government ownership out, government management out, is not so easy, Sujit.
Absolutely. Secondly, what about welfare industry? What about insurance, for instance? If government doesn't have presence in the insurance sector, you see, a poor man will never be able to get a good insurance policy for himself because unlike other countries, developed countries, we don't have social security. We depend on these insurance to lead our lives. So now what happens if even insurance is completely privatized?
I would agree with you. I would, in a country like India, I would take insurance, especially general insurance, and also to a certain extent, life insurance, which comes in the form of a pension to people in retirement, should certainly be in a more welfare-oriented measure, such that the common man benefits. And when you talk about a welfare-oriented touch to business, the private sector will always shy away from it. So it is the public sector which will have to get into it.
Isn't this government trying to kind of not I'm not just talking about this government per se, I'm talking about governments. Aren't they just trying to absolve themselves from wealth creation, absolve themselves from profit making, and get into just spending money which they are kind of getting through taxes and getting through monetization and so on and so forth? Why are government not made responsible for creating wealth?
Sudhi, the fact of the matter is that, India never really had, according to me, a very clear policy on wealth creation. We started with a hybrid model of socialism come capitalism, and I think we failed on both the fronts. Moreover, worldwide, except for creating infrastructure where, return on capital is sometimes overlooked because you need it, you can't do without it. The governments worldwide have tended not to give returns on capital invested. It's so with India, it is so with America, it is so everywhere. So when you talk of wealth creation, I think it is the private sector which has always been given that role. But like in India, as I said, there was little clarity. In 1991, then we had reforms which said you have to be giving primacy to the private sector. But down the line, once you look at the kind of interference that the government does in businesses through all kinds of regulators, regulations, laws, even that gets impaired. So wealth creation has been stunted because of that in India.
No, I am not just talking about wealth creation per se, as in the government trying to create wealth, but facilitating wealth creators. The fact remains that, like you rightly said yesterday when we were discussing, you said that, when the Indian Prime Minister goes to America, the Americans ensure that a couple of deals are signed with India. Americans ensure that India goes and gets a couple of, gives a couple of contracts to America. So was the case with Israel. We saw how Netanyahu treated our Prime Minister. But whenever other leaders comes to India, where do we get them to sign any contracts? Where do we get them to sign any trade agreements? My question is, there is no pressure on the government to create wealth.
I think, Sujit, a sense of trade and diplomacy was certainly missing. We had some kind of a pseudo notion, and the others took advantage of it. We also had a notion that you can't have what Trump started very openly, a transaction-oriented diplomacy, which is you do transactions for me and I'm going to be good to you. I think it is time for India to at least have a more clearer shift to this, that diplomacy and trade must go together and the interests of India must be given priority over those of anybody else, Sujit. I would agree with you, Sujit.
Because any relationship that we pursue, any relationship that we follow should be that of a trade relationship, because it should benefit the people of India. Having great relationship, having fantastic events, how does that help India in any form or, in any way? So the fact remains that, that is something that I think there should be an attitude shift. So coming back to, and possibly my last question, Akhilesh.
No, I have a question for you, Sujit.
Okay.
Privatizing, demonetizing, and disinvestment have huge political challenges. It is very easy to make this statement, but when it comes to the brass tacks, there are a lot of hindrances that come. First allegation that comes is valuation. One of the reasons Air India never got sold was the valuation was too high. The government was expecting that a bankrupt, loss-making airline will give it a value of 50,000 crores. It didn't deserve all those zeros that they were trying to add. So valuation becomes a big hindrance. The second thing, Sujit, that we have seen is that you are noticing in Bombay when the Maharashtra government decided to allot a new plot in Kanjurmarg for a metro shed. The central government came and said that, hey, this land belongs to me, and they couldn't do it. So the next issue politically we have is titles. Let me give you a very interesting example. Scooters India is being sold off and it has some prime land near Lucknow. The sad part is that the government is not even able to identify which is the parcel of land that belongs to Scooters India. It is that pathetic a scene. So the first challenge, Sujit, is valuation. The second is trade unions. The third is politicians. The fourth, as I told you, is title-related issues. It's not easy selling government assets from a very political perspective. The fifth, of course, as I say, is with the government interest being involved, nobody wants to bid for it. Like NHAI has been trying to sell roads. It had a target to sell roads worth about 30,000 crores a year. They couldn't even manage one third of that. So my question to you, Sujit, politically, how would these challenges be met to ensure that privatization and disinvestment and monetization takes place?
See, I think, Akhilesh, to be very honest with you, if the government wants to sell something, it sells. And it sells very easily. So many airports were privatized. Easily, no problem, no hindrance. You see,
Profit making airports.
absolutely correct. So whichever project is profit making, there is no hindrance. Wherever there are problems, there is bound to be hindrance and there is bound to be problems. So the fact remains that I think, Akhilesh, more than politics, I think the biggest hindrance is whether the company is making profits, whether the company is conducive to a profitable kind of an environment, or it is basically, living in this attitude, management attitude of suffering losses and kind of being a typical PSU. That's the point. In fact, the question I was going to ask you back to our first this thing is, Akhilesh, finally, are we going to be India Private Limited? Are we going to be that in the future? Do you see that happening?
I don't see it happening, Sujit. And the reason I don't see it happening is the vested interests of politicians and political parties are so deeply entrenched in the economy. They make tons of money out of it, or they are able to virtually blackmail us by all kinds of legislation by virtue of the fact that our financial interests are involved. Entrepreneurs are entrenched with their investments in it. That at no point of time will the Parliament of India, consisting of all the parties, get together and say, let's work towards India Private Limited. It will become all kinds of parties private limited, as once we had discussed. But India Private Limited, I think, is not going to happen, Sujit.
And more importantly, Akhilesh, before, I know it was my last question, but one more last question. Most importantly, Akhilesh, this worry about privatization being monopolized by one or two companies. How do you see that?
I, of course, look at it as failure of our political system and failure to keep a check on the government. But just going on a tangent on your previous question, Sujit, I am not one who advocates that, private sector is the paragon of everything possible. In fact, we have seen enough corruption and fraud in the private sector all the time.
Correct.
The point of differentiation is that there is a pressure of accountability, transparency, and return on investment on the private sector, which is missing in the public sector. And that is why we end up favoring it. But otherwise, if a private sector also does not have accountability or transparency or any kind of return on investment pressures, you'll have the same mismanagement that happens in the public sector. And that is what we are trying to emphasize, that get in that kind of management which has accountability enforced on it, which is perforce to get into transparency, and return on investment is questioned. Because the government does not have any of these in its public sector enterprises, is where we say privatize it.
We should do one show on mismanagement per se. The concept of mismanagement. No, I'll tell you why. Because somewhere down the line, the people who were made to head these private sector banks, PSU banks, were bureaucrats. They were IAS officers who were taught administration. Okay, before he could take over a fertilizer company, he or she would be a collector in a district. So all of a sudden, overnight, in 24 hours, from a collector of a district, from an administrator, this person has to metamorphosize into a business person, So, and we are expecting that person to metamorphosize in 24 hours into a business person and then make profits for this country. So somewhere down the line, I think the IPs through which we looked at privatization, we looked at PSUs itself was wrong. The people we entrusted our PSUs were wrong. So I guess that's the first question that we need to discuss, and let's do one show exclusively on this one, Akhilesh.
But Sujit, point very well taken. You're talking about, how does a Babu suddenly become, let's say, the chairman of Air India?
Correct.
But doesn't that also apply to a politician? How does a politician suddenly become a defense minister, an oil minister, or a finance minister, or whatever you might want to say?
Oh, yes,
It starts from there, according to me.
Yes, absolutely correct. We should start from there. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I take back my words. I also say how a minister becoming an aviation minister, he would have not seen an airport, from close quarters, but he becomes an aviation minister, he becomes an oil minister, he becomes so on and so forth. Yeah. I do agree to that. Yes, let's discuss on mismanagement of public sector units, Akhilesh. We'll do that shortly.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Akhilesh.
Thank you, Sujit.
Hello everyone. HW News English is 2 years old now. When we started this venture, we promised ourselves one thing, that news should remain free, because right to know is the right of every Indian. But to keep news free for everyone, we need support from some of you. And thus we have rolled out membership on our YouTube channel HW News English. But mind you, the membership is completely voluntary. The programs that we were doing earlier, that we are doing now, will continue to remain free. First level is a basic level. Here you can be our supporter by paying rupees 199 per month. This membership gives you certain perks and benefits. The perks include unique badges in front of your name, a live show from Mr. Sujit Nair and from Mr. Akhilesh Bhargava per month for our members. You can also vote in some exclusive members-only polls. Now the second level is Super Supporter. Here you can be our Super Supporter by paying rupees 3,999 per month. This membership will include every perk that comes with basic level. Additionally, our super supporters can be a part of a WhatsApp group where we can have discussions and suggestions on various topics. The second perk includes a gift pack with our merchandise. And the third perk is a Google Meet with Mr. Sujit Nair, where you can join the meet and ask your questions to Mr. Nair face to face. Lastly, if you like, we would give a shout out to our super supporters in our programs. So, hope to see you soon with our badges.
The emerging backbone of India's economy are our startups. They represent India's youth, they represent India's aspirations, they represent India's hopes, they represent our fight against an insensitive bureaucracy, against an insensitive system. They represent the fight of our startup entrepreneurs against an indifferent system, against an insensitive banker, against challenges of dealing with the government, and against all the odds with which they started a startup. Every startup begins with a brilliant idea, a unique idea, an idea which nobody else thought of, and that becomes a business enterprise. We are starting our next episode series on what we call startup stories. It is our curiosity to know what was that idea, what was the motivation, what was the determination because of which one talented entrepreneur, without any background of business perhaps, decided to venture out on his own and create a successful enterprise. These are the ideas that motivate us also. If you have a startup story which is interesting, we would want to talk to you also. Come back to us with your own startup stories, and you might also be the person we would like to talk to.